The first letter I ever held in my hands was dated November the 8th, 1841, and it was written in a handwriting so careful and deliberate that every stroke looked like it had been carved rather than penned. The paper was oilskin, treated with something waxy that had kept it from rotting for over 160 years, and the ink was a deep reddish brown that I later learned was made from boiled alder bark mixed with bear grease. The letter was addressed to no one. It had no signature, but it described in plain and patient English the terms of a trade agreement between a family of settlers in the Hoh River Valley on the Olympic Peninsula of Washington and a group the letter referred to only as the Tall Ones. 12 pounds of salt and a steel axe head, offered at the flat rock below the second falls. In return, 4 bundles of a root the letter called ghost cedar, which cured the croup in children and stopped infection in open wounds faster than anything the family had ever seen. The letter said the arrangement had been in place for 3 years by that point. It said the Tall Ones had never broken their side of the bargain, and it said, in a line that I have read so many times, the words have worn grooves in my memory, "They are not beasts and they are not spirits, and I will record what they are so that my children and their children know the truth of what lives in these mountains and has lived here longer than any of us." That letter was the first of 214. I found them in the autumn of 2012, wrapped in oilcloth bundles inside a cedar chest that had been walled up behind the plaster of a farmhouse on the Hoh River Road, 6 miles east of the town of Forks, Washington. The farmhouse had been in my family for 5 generations. The letters spanned 119 years, from 1838 to 1957, written by 7 different hands across 4 generations of the same family, my family, the Whitmores, and they documented in meticulous and unflinching detail a trading relationship between my ancestors and a population of large, bipedal, hair-covered beings living in the deep interior of the Olympic Mountains. A relationship that survived droughts and floods and 2 world wars, and the complete transformation of the American frontier into the American century. A relationship that ended abruptly and permanently in the winter of 1957, when the federal government found out about it and made sure it could never happen again. My name is Norman Whitmore, and I was born in 1940 in the same farmhouse where I found those letters. I am 85 years old. I was a records clerk for Jefferson County for 38 years, which means I spent my professional life filing documents, indexing deeds, and cataloging the paper trail that civilizations leave behind when they want to remember what happened. I know how to read old handwriting. I know how to date paper and ink. I know the difference between a document that has been fabricated and one that has been lived in, handled, folded, and refolded by hands that needed what was written on it the way a farmer needs an almanac. The Whitmore letters are real. They are the most important historical documents I have ever encountered, and they have been in my family's walls for over 60 years, sealed there by my father in late November of 1957, weeks before the government arrived to take everything else. But I need to go back further than the letters. I need to start with the house itself, and the family that built it, and the valley they chose, because none of this makes sense unless you understand that the Hoh River Valley in the 1830s was not a place anyone settled by accident. It was a place you went to disappear. My great-great-grandfather, Amos Whitmore, came west from Tennessee in 1836. He was 29, a former tanner who had lost his shop to a creditor and his wife to typhoid in the same year. He walked most of the way to Oregon Territory with a mule, 2 rifles, and a leather satchel containing his wife's Bible and a set of tanning tools he refused to sell no matter how hungry he got. He arrived on the Olympic Peninsula in the spring of 1837 and found a stretch of river bottom along the Hoh that was flat enough to farm, sheltered enough to survive a winter, and remote enough that the nearest white settlement was 40 miles of forest in any direction. He built a cabin, cleared 2 acres, and began turning rainforest into farmland. The Olympic Peninsula in the 1830s was the wettest, densest, most impenetrable wilderness on the continent. 12 to 14 feet of rain a year. Old-growth Sitka spruce and western red cedar growing so thick the canopy blocks the sun entirely, and the understory is a tangle of sword fern and devil's club and fallen timber stacked like kindling by a giant. You cut your way in, and the forest closes behind you like a wound healing. Amos chose this place because whatever he was running from in Tennessee was bad enough that all of that seemed like a reasonable alternative. He stayed. He cleared more land. He built a bigger cabin. And sometime in the first winter, according to the earliest letter in the collection, dated March of 1838, he encountered the tall ones. The 1838 letter is the most damaged in the collection. It was written on the inside of a tanned deer hide, which is how I know Amos was still using his tanning skills even after he'd given up the trade. The handwriting is rougher than the later letters, less practiced, and some sections are illegible, where the hide has cracked or the ink has faded. But the legible portions describe an encounter that happened during a snowstorm in February of that year. Amos had gone upriver to check a trapline he'd set for marten, and a tree had come down across the trail, blocking his return path. While he was working to clear it, he became aware that he was being watched. He wrote, "And I'm doing my best with the faded ink here," that he looked up and saw a figure standing in the tree line about 30 yards away. He described it as taller than any man and covered in dark hair the color of wet bark. He said it was holding something in its hands, though he couldn't tell what. He said his first instinct was to reach for his rifle, but something stopped him. The figure wasn't threatening. It was just standing there, still as the trees around it, watching him with what he described as a calm curiosity, the way a man watches a neighbor he hasn't met yet work in his yard. Amos wrote that he stood there for what felt like a long time, and then the figure turned and walked into the forest without a sound. He said the stride was enormous, covering ground at a speed that didn't match the deliberate, unhurried way the figure moved. He went back to clearing the fallen tree and finished his trapline check and returned home. He didn't write about the encounter again for several months, which tells me he was doing what most people in this situation do. He was trying to convince himself it hadn't happened. The next letter is from September of 1838. Amos had been sick. A chest illness, a cough that wouldn't clear, blood in his sputum. In 1838, on the Olympic Peninsula, a chest infection was a death sentence. The nearest doctor was in Port Townsend, 4 days' travel away, and Amos was too sick to make the trip. He wrote that he had resigned himself to dying in his cabin. Then, one morning, he opened his cabin door and found a bundle on his doorstep. It was wrapped in strips of cedar bark woven together in a pattern he'd never seen, tight and precise like basket work. Inside were 3 things: a cluster of roots, pale and woody, that smelled like camphor and something sharper underneath. A ball of dried moss packed with what he later determined were crushed berries of some kind, and a flat piece of bark with a drawing scratched into it. The drawing showed a figure roughly human in shape but larger, placing something on a horizontal surface. Below the horizontal surface was a second figure, smaller, lying down. Amos interpreted the drawing as instructions. The larger figure was showing the smaller figure how to use what had been left. He had nothing to lose. He boiled the roots and drank the tea. He packed the moss and berry mixture into a poultice and applied it to his chest. Within 2 days, the cough began to break up. Within a week, he was on his feet. Within 2 weeks, he was back working his trapline. He wrote in a line that still makes me stop when I read it, "I do not know what manner of being left this medicine at my door. but I am alive because of it, and I owe a debt I do not know how to repay. That debt became the foundation of everything that followed. Amos began leaving things at the flat rock below the second waterfall on the Ho, a spot about a mile upriver from his cabin. He started with food: dried venison, cornmeal, a bag of salt. The salt was the first thing that disappeared. He went back the next morning and it was gone, and in its place was another bundle of the medicinal roots. Amos left more salt. The salt disappeared. More roots appeared. A pattern established itself, and then the pattern grew. By 1840, Amos had figured out what the tall ones valued. Salt was the primary currency. They wanted it desperately in quantities that suggested they had no natural source of it on the interior side of the mountains. They also wanted metal, axe heads, knife blades, even nails. In exchange, they offered things from the deep mountains that Amos could not have obtained on his own. Medicinal roots that grew only at high elevation, dried meat from animals Amos couldn't identify by taste or texture, but which kept longer than any jerky he'd ever made, and tanned hides of extraordinary quality, soft and supple and waterproof, tanned using a process that Amos, a trained tanner, could not replicate no matter how carefully he examined them. The trading was never face-to-face. The flat rock was a dead drop. Amos would leave his offering and walk away. When he returned, his goods would be gone, and the tall one's goods would be in their place. He described the arrangement with the kind of practical language a farmer uses for a business dealing with a neighbor. It was commerce, two parties exchanging what they had for what they needed, and the fact that one party happened to be 7 feet tall and covered in hair did not, in Amos Whitmore's estimation, change the fundamental nature of the transaction. I want to pause here and tell you something about how I found the letters, because the story of their discovery is part of their story. In the autumn of 2012, I was 72 years old and recently widowed. My wife, Betty, had died in August after a long fight with emphysema, and I was doing what widowers do, finding projects to fill the silence. The farmhouse on the Ho River Road had been in my family for 5 generations. I'd inherited it when my father died in 1989. But Betty and I had our own place in Port Angeles. After Betty died, I started going to the farmhouse more often. The quiet felt different when it was a choice. The house needed work. It was built in sections over 150 years, each generation adding on, and the result was a structure that made no architectural sense, but had a stubborn solidity, like a man who has been broken and repaired so many times that the repairs have become part of his character. I decided to start with the back bedroom, my father's old room. The plaster walls were cracked and bowing. I hired a local handyman named Tom Henderson to strip the plaster and check the framing. Tom was a retired logger, 70 years old, the kind of man who showed up with his own coffee thermos. He started on the north wall on a Tuesday morning and found nothing but old lath and horsehair insulation. Then he started on the east wall. I was in the kitchen when I heard him stop hammering. Not a pause, a stop. I walked back and found Tom standing in front of the opened wall with his pry bar hanging at his side. Behind the plaster, between the studs, there was a cedar chest, about 3 feet long, 18 inches wide, made of hand-hewn cedar planks joined without nails, using a tongue-and-groove method that was extremely old. The chest had been fitted into the wall cavity with precision, sealed with beeswax along every seam. Whoever put it there wanted whatever was inside to last. I told Tom to leave it and go have lunch. He understood it was a family matter and left without asking questions. I sat on the floor of my father's bedroom with the cedar chest in my lap, and I pried the lid open with a butter knife because I didn't want to damage the wax seal any more than I had to. The smell that came out when I lifted the lid was cedar and beeswax, and something underneath that I recognized immediately. The same oily, slightly sweet smell that permeated everything in that house. The smell of the Hoh Valley itself, absorbed into wood and cloth over generations. Inside the chest were the letters, wrapped in oilcloth, bundled by decade, and tied with leather cords. 214 documents spanning 119 years. I picked up the first bundle, untied the cord, unfolded the oilcloth, and read the first letter. The November 1841 letter I described at the beginning of this story, and I sat on that floor for the next 6 hours, reading until the light failed and I had to get a lamp. I need to tell you what the letters contained. Not all of them, because many were routine, the way any long-term business correspondence becomes routine. Amos left salt and an axe head. The roots appeared. Amos left nails and sugar. Dried meat appeared. But certain letters stood out because they documented moments when the trading relationship went beyond commerce and became something else entirely. In 1844, Amos Whitmore married a woman named Constance Bell, who had come west with a missionary group and ended up stranded in the Hoh Valley when the group's leader died of dysentery, and the rest turned back. Constance was 31, educated, and had a handwriting that was markedly more refined than her husband's. She took over most of the letter writing after the marriage, and her accounts are more detailed and more observant than Amos's. It was Constance who first described seeing a tall one clearly. In a letter dated June of 1846, Constance wrote that she had gone to the Flat Rock alone to leave a delivery of salt and honey. She was earlier than usual, arriving at first light, and as she approached the rock, she saw a figure standing on the opposite bank of the river. She described it as a female, taller than Amos by a full head, which would have put it well over 7 feet. She said the hair was a dark brown, almost black, and that it hung long from the head and shoulders, but was shorter on the torso and limbs. She said the face was broad and flat with a heavy brow, but that the eyes were deeply set and dark and carried an expression she struggled to describe. She settled on the word contemplative. The being was watching her with what Constance called a measured thoughtfulness, the way a woman appraises another woman she has heard about but never met. Constance set down her bundle on the rock and stood there. She wrote that her hands were trembling, but that she forced herself not to run, because running felt like it would break something that couldn't be repaired. The figure across the river watched her for perhaps a minute. Then it raised one hand, palm outward, and held it there. Constance, not knowing what else to do, raised her own hand the same way. The figure lowered its hand, turned, and walked into the forest. And Constance walked home and sat at the kitchen table and shook for an hour before she could hold a pen steady enough to write. That moment, the raised palm appears again and again in the letters across generations. It became the gesture of recognition between the Whitmores and the tall ones, a greeting, an assurance, a way of saying without words, "I know who you are and I mean you no harm." Constance taught it to her children. They taught it to theirs. Over 119 years, 7 members of the Whitmore family raised their palms to beings that the rest of the world refused to believe existed, and the gesture was always returned. The trading evolved over the decades. By the 1860s, Amos and Constance's son, Henry Whitmore, had expanded the exchanges significantly. Henry was born in 1847 and grew up knowing about the tall ones the way other children knew about the weather. It was simply a fact of life on the Hoh River. You planted in April, you harvested in September, and you left salt at the Flat Rock every few weeks because that was the arrangement. Henry's letters, which begin in 1865 when he was 18, describe a more structured trading schedule. Deliveries twice a month on the new moon and the full moon, which Henry believed was the tall one's way of keeping time. The goods had expanded on both sides. Henry traded cloth, flour, refined sugar, coffee beans, tobacco, and increasingly sophisticated metal tools, chisels, draw knives. even a small handsaw. In return, the tall ones provided not just the medicinal roots and dried meat, but also something Henry described as a thick, amber-colored paste that came packed in hollowed-out sections of log, sealed with pine resin. Henry spent considerable effort trying to understand what this paste was. Intensely sweet with a bitter undertone and a numbing quality on the tongue. It healed cuts and burns faster than anything he'd tried. He fed it to a sick calf, and the calf recovered overnight. He gave some to a neighbor named Clyde Patterson, who suffered chronic joint pain, and Patterson's pain disappeared for 3 weeks. Henry wrote, "Whatever they are not simple. They make things. They prepare medicines. They understand healing in ways that we do not, and I begin to suspect they have understood it for a very long time." Henry Whitmore's letters are the heart of the collection, both because they span the longest period, from 1865 to 1907, and because Henry was the first Whitmore to attempt something beyond transactional exchange. He wanted to communicate, not just trade goods, but trade meaning. In 1872, Henry began leaving drawings at the Flat Rock along with his trade goods. Simple pictures scratched onto bark with a charcoal stick. A picture of the sun, a picture of the river, a picture of his cabin with smoke coming from the chimney. He left them the way you'd leave a note for someone who doesn't speak your language, hoping that images could carry what words couldn't. The first response took 3 months. Henry arrived at the Flat Rock one morning and found, alongside the usual trade goods, a piece of bark with a drawing. The drawing showed 3 mountain peaks, and below them, a series of tall figures in what Henry interpreted as a family group. 5 adults and 2 smaller ones. They were drawn in profile, walking along a ridgeline with remarkable detail. Proportion, movement, the way a body shifts weight when climbing a slope. These were not stick figures, they were representations made by a mind that observed carefully and reproduced what it saw with skill. Henry wrote about it that evening, and his handwriting is noticeably less controlled, the letters larger and more spaced. He wrote, "I have spent 7 years trading with these beings, and I have never known them beyond what they leave at the rock. Tonight I know that they have families, they have children. They walk their mountains the way I walk my fields. They are a people. God forgive me for ever thinking otherwise." The drawing exchanges continued for years. Henry and the tall ones developed what I can only call a pictorial conversation. Henry drew his family, his animals, his house in different seasons. The tall ones drew their mountains, their trails, the animals they shared the forest with. Over time, the drawings became more complex. Henry drew rain falling on crops, and then the crops growing tall, trying to communicate cause and effect. The tall ones responded with a drawing of a tree falling, then the same tree lying on the ground with mushrooms growing from it. Decay and renewal. They understood the concept perfectly. In 1881, something happened that elevated the relationship beyond anything Amos could have imagined. Henry's wife, a woman named Pearl Adams, whom he'd married in 1870, was pregnant with their 3rd child. The pregnancy was difficult. Pearl had lost a baby the year before, stillborn at 7 months, and this pregnancy was following a similar pattern. She was bleeding intermittently, unable to keep food down, and growing weaker by the week. The nearest doctor was now in Forks, a smaller distance than in Amos's day, but still a full day's journey over bad roads, and Pearl was too fragile to make the trip. Henry left a drawing at the Flat Rock. It showed a figure lying down, a woman with a rounded belly. He drew lines coming from the belly that he meant to represent pain or distress. He didn't know if the message would be understood. He didn't know if the tall ones would care, even if they did understand. But he was desperate, and desperation makes theologians of us all. 2 days later, Henry found the largest delivery the tall ones had ever made. 7 bundles of the medicinal roots, triple the usual quantity. an entire hollowed log of the amber paste, enough to last months. And something new, a pouch made of hide, stitched closed with sinew, containing a powder that was pale green and smelled like pine needles and licorice, and something underneath that Henry described as clean, like the air after a lightning strike. There was a drawing with the delivery. It showed the pregnant figure again, this time with an arrow pointing to the figure's mouth, and beside the arrow, a representation of the green powder. "Drink this." That's what the drawing said. "Give this to the woman who is dying and have her drink it." Pearl drank the green powder mixed into hot water for 14 days. Her bleeding stopped on the 3rd day. Her appetite returned on the 5th. By the 10th day, she was walking to the river and back without needing to rest. On November the 19th, 1881, she delivered a healthy baby girl, 8 pounds 2 ounces, in the back bedroom of the farmhouse where I would find the letters 131 years later. They named the girl Constance after Amos's wife, and Henry wrote in his letter that evening, "Pearl is alive and the baby is strong, and I owe a debt that salt and steel cannot repay. I have been leaving goods at the Rock for 16 years, and I understood it as trade. I understand it now as something closer to kinship. They saved my wife. They saved my daughter. No human neighbor has ever done as much." That letter breaks me every time I read it, because of the word kinship. Henry Whitmore, in 1881, living at the edge of the known world, understood that the tall ones were not animals to be exploited or curiosities to be studied. They were neighbors. They were, in the way that matters most, family. Henry's daughter Constance grew up knowing the full truth of what lived in the mountains. She was the 3rd generation to maintain the trading relationship, and her letters, beginning in 1901, are the most detailed in the collection. Educated at a mission school in Port Angeles, she had a naturalist's eye. Where Amos recorded trades and Henry recorded emotions, Constance recorded data. She measured footprints at the flat rock, 16 to 21 inches in length, suggesting multiple individuals. She cataloged seasonal variations in trade goods and mapped vocalization locations to estimate the group's movement patterns through the mountains. Constance was also the first Whitmore to have prolonged visual contact. In a letter from 1909, she described an encounter at the flat rock at dusk. She found one of them standing on the near bank, not the far side. An older male, heavily built, with graying hair at the temples and shoulders. Close to 8 feet tall, lean and muscled in a way that defied any frame of reference she had. It smelled like wet cedar bark and turned earth and something warm underneath, like a horse stable on a cold morning. It did not run. She did not run. They stood 20 feet apart, and the old male raised its palm, and Constance raised hers, the gesture passed down through 60 years and 3 generations. She wrote, "He knew me, not my face, my line. He knew I was a Whitmore the way I would know the daughter of a friend I had not seen in 30 years, by resemblance, by the way I stood at that rock, by the fact that I raised my hand the way my grandmother raised hers." That encounter changed Constance. In her subsequent letters, she stops referring to the tall ones as beings or figures and begins calling them the people. She writes about them the way an anthropologist would write about a neighboring tribe, with respect and specificity and a growing sense that what she was witnessing was not an anomaly but a civilization. A small one, hidden, silent, adapted to a life that left almost no trace. But a civilization nonetheless. They had medicine, they had art, they had family structures, they had trade. They had a concept of mutual obligation that had sustained a relationship with her family for 70 years. The word she settled on to describe what distinguished them in a letter from 1912 was grace. The Whitmore trading continued through the first half of the 20th century. Constance's son, my grandfather Walter Whitmore, was born in 1904 and took over the trading when Constance's health declined in the late 1920s. Walter was quieter than his mother, his letters shorter, more like a bookkeeper's ledger. 3 pounds salt, 1 draw knife, left at the rock, March the 15th. Received 2 bundles root, 1 pouch amber paste. But he maintained the relationship with the same reliability his family had shown for nearly a century. Walter's letters contain one revelation I've spent years thinking about. In 1937, he wrote that the number of tall ones visiting the rock had decreased. Fewer vocalizations in the mountains, fewer tracks, deliveries delayed by a week or more. He wrote, "I count the tracks, and where there were once 5 or 6 different sets, there are now 3. The old one that Mother called the Elder has not come in 2 years. I believe he is gone. The young ones are fewer. The mountains feel emptier than when I was a boy, and I fear that what my grandfather found is becoming something my grandchildren will only read about." I read that letter and I think about what was happening to the Olympic Peninsula in the 1930s. The logging industry had arrived in force. Old-growth forest that had stood for 1,000 years was being cut at millions of board feet per year. Roads were being punched into valleys that had never seen a wheel. The tall ones were being squeezed. Their territory was shrinking. Their corridors between mountain ranges were being severed by clear-cuts and logging roads. Walter saw it happening and could do nothing about it. He was a subsistence farmer trading salt for medicine, with a dwindling population of beings that the rest of the world said didn't exist. Walter married my mother, June Cooper, in 1938. I was born in 1940. My brother Roy came along in 1943. And here is where I enter the story, not as the narrator of the letters, but as a witness to the last chapter of what they described. I knew about the trading, not from the letters which I wouldn't find for another 72 years, but from my father. Walter told Roy and me about the tall ones when I was 7 years old. He told us the way another father might tell his children about the family business, which is exactly what it was. He said there were people living in the mountains who were not like us, who had been there longer than anyone, and who traded with our family at a rock by the river. He said it was a secret that Whitmores kept, and that keeping it was as important as anything else we'd ever do. He said if we told anyone, the tall ones would stop coming, and something that had survived for over 100 years would die because of us. I was 7, and I understood the gravity of what he was telling me the way children understand gravity, not through reason, but through the seriousness on his face and the tone in his voice. I saw one of them when I was 9. It was the summer of 1949, and my father had taken me to the flat rock for the first time. He said I was old enough. He carried a burlap sack with 5 pounds of salt, a box of .22 rifle cartridges, which he had discovered the tall ones valued highly, not for the brass casings, which they seemed to use as material for small tools and ornaments, but for the lead itself, which Walter believed they smelted and reshaped using methods he couldn't determine. We walked the mile upriver in the early morning, and my father set the sack on the flat rock and stood back. I asked him if we were going to wait. He said no. He said the arrangement was that we left the goods and came back later. That was the protocol. That was how the trust had been maintained for 111 years. You didn't wait and watch. You left your offering and you gave them the dignity of privacy. But as we were turning to walk back downstream, I looked across the river, and there, standing among the spruce trees on the far bank, was a shape that did not belong to any tree. My father saw it too. He put his hand on my shoulder and squeezed, which I understood to mean, stay still and be quiet. The shape moved. It stepped out from behind a tree trunk, and for the first time in my life, I saw one of the people. It was not the largest of them based on the tracks my father had shown me. It stood maybe 7 feet tall, lean and long-limbed, with hair that was a reddish brown, lighter than I'd expected. Its face was broad, the nose wide and flat, the mouth set in a line that could have been either stern or simply neutral. The eyes were dark, almost entirely dark, and they were looking at me, not at my father, at me, the new one, the child who had been brought to the rock for the first time. My father raised his palm. The being raised its palm in return, and then it looked at me again, and I cannot explain what I felt except to say that it was not fear. It was being seen, not glanced at, seen. The way you are seen by something that has been watching your family for 100 years and has finally laid eyes on the newest member. There was an appraisal in that gaze, and beneath the appraisal, something that I would now, at 85, call welcome. It turned and walked into the trees, and my father and I walked home, and he didn't speak for the first mile. When he finally did, he said, "Now you know." And I did. I knew what the Whitmores had always known, that the mountains were not empty, that the forest held something ancient and real and careful and proud, and that my family had been trusted by that something for longer than most American institutions had existed. End of part 1. For the next 8 years, I went with my father to the flat rock every month. Sometimes Roy came too. We never saw the tall ones again at the rock, though we heard them twice. Once a low vocalization that rolled down the valley like distant thunder, and once the sound of wood striking wood in a rhythm that was too regular and too purposeful to be anything natural. The trades continued: salt, metal, ammunition, cloth, sugar, coffee. In return, the roots, the paste, the dried meat, the occasional drawing that my father collected and stored in the same oilcloth wrappings that held the older letters. And then, in the winter of 1957, everything ended. It started with a surveyor. In October of 1957, a two-man team from the United States Forest Service arrived in the Hoh River Valley to conduct a boundary survey for a proposed expansion of the Olympic National Forest. The lead surveyor was a man named Gerald Wick, and he was accompanied by a younger man whose name my father never learned. They spent 3 weeks in the valley running transit lines and hammering stakes into ground that my family had walked for 120 years. My father didn't like them being there, but he had no legal standing to object. The river bottom was privately held, but the forest above it was federal land, and the Forest Service had every right to survey it. Gerald Wick was thorough, too thorough. His survey lines took him upriver, past the farmhouse, past the second waterfall, and directly to the flat rock. My father came home from town on a Thursday afternoon and found Wick sitting on the front porch, waiting for him. Wick had a notebook in his hand and a look on his face that my father described to me years later as the look of a man who has found something he doesn't understand and has decided to be angry about it instead of curious. Wick told my father that he'd found the flat rock and the trade goods that were sitting on it at the time: a bundle of the medicinal roots and a pouch of the amber paste, left there by the tall ones in exchange for the salt and coffee my father had delivered 2 days earlier. Wick said he'd also found tracks, large tracks, barefoot in the mud near the rock. He said the tracks didn't match any animal in his field guide, and he'd measured them at 19 inches long and 8 inches wide. He asked my father to explain. My father told him he didn't know what Wick was talking about. Wick didn't believe him. He said he'd also found the drawings. Some of the older bark drawings had been left at the rock over the years and had accumulated in the crevices and hollows around it, partially preserved by the damp climate. Wick had collected several of them. He laid them out on the porch railing, and my father saw, for the first time outside of the family's private collection, the pictorial records of a century of communication between the Whitmores and the people. Pictures of mountains and families and trade goods and the raised palm that meant recognition. Wick asked my father again to explain. My father said the drawings were old, probably from the Ho tribe, probably historical artifacts. Wick said the paper and the bark were too well preserved to be more than a few decades old. He said some of the drawings depicted steel tools that the Ho tribe wouldn't have had access to in the period the bark suggested. He said the tracks were fresh, made within the last 48 hours based on the sharpness of the edges in the mud. And he said that he was going to include all of this in his survey report because it was his professional obligation to document unusual findings on federal land. My father asked him not to. I imagine the asking was more like pleading, though my father was not a man who pleaded easily. He told Wick that there were things in these mountains that were better left alone. Wick said he didn't have that luxury. He was a government surveyor. He documented what he found. That was his job. Wick filed his report in November of 1957. I know this because my father told me, and because decades later, I used my position as a county records clerk to trace what happened to that report. It went from the Forest Service regional office in Portland to the district supervisor in Olympia. From Olympia, it was flagged and forwarded to the Bureau of Land Management in Washington, D.C. Somewhere in that chain, someone read about 19-inch barefoot tracks, pictorial communications between a settler family and an unidentified species, and a trading relationship that had been operating on federal land for over a century, and they decided this was a matter that required more than a surveyor's report. In January of 1958, 3 men came to the farmhouse. They arrived in a dark green government sedan, which was unusual because the Ho River Road in 1958 was barely a road at all, and most people who drove it used trucks. 2 of the men were in civilian clothes, suits, and overcoats. The third was wearing a Forest Service uniform, but he wasn't anyone my father recognized from the local ranger station. They didn't call ahead. They didn't make an appointment. They just showed up on a Thursday morning while my father was splitting firewood and my mother was hanging laundry, and Roy and I were at school. My father told me about this visit years later in 1974, after I'd come home from a weekend at the farmhouse and asked him why the east wall of the back bedroom had newer plaster than the rest of the house. He sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd later find myself reading the letters, and he told me the whole story. What follows is what he told me, supplemented by what I later pieced together from the letters and from a very limited number of public records that survived whatever the government did to clean up after itself. The 2 civilians identified themselves as representatives of the Department of the Interior. They showed credentials too quickly to read. The man in the Forest Service uniform introduced himself as Regional Director Howard Sims. They sat at the kitchen table, and the older civilian opened a briefcase containing Wick's survey report and photographs of the flat rock, the trade goods, the tracks, the bark drawings. Wick hadn't just filed a report. He'd documented everything with a camera. The older civilian said the report described activities of significant concern to the federal government. He used the phrase unidentified biological entities, the way someone uses a phrase they've been given by a committee, carefully and without inflection. My father denied knowing anything. The civilian smiled, and my father said it was the smile of a man who knows you're lying and has decided to let you keep lying because it doesn't matter. The younger civilian opened a second folder: property records, tax filings, a genealogical chart tracing the Whitmore family from 1837 to the present. They had researched us thoroughly, the younger man said, and my father repeated this word for word. Mr. Whitmore, we know about the trading. We know it's been going on for a long time. What we need from you is everything you have, every document, every record, every physical specimen, and we need you to understand that this activity is now concluded. My father asked what would happen if he refused. The answer was simple. The government could condemn the property under the Antiquities Act, cooperate and keep the farm, or refuse and lose everything. My father cooperated. He gave them the trade goods that were in the house at the time, several bundles of the roots, 2 containers of the amber paste, dried meat, and a collection of bark drawings spanning 20 years. He gave them his own journals, which were more modest versions of the letters his ancestors had written, documenting trades and observations from the 1930s through the 1950s. He gave them everything they asked for. He did not give them the letters. He did not give them the cedar chest. He did not tell them that 119 years of documentation existed in oilcloth bundles in that chest, because the chest was in the back bedroom behind the plaster wall, where my father had sealed it 2 months earlier. He had sealed it the day after Gerald Wick sat on his porch and showed him the drawings. My father knew the moment Wick laid those bark pieces on the railing that something was coming. He didn't know what, but he knew the letters had to disappear, and he had enough time to make that happen before the government arrived. The 3 men left with 2 boxes of material. Before leaving, the older civilian told my father that the Flat Rock area was now off limits, that any future contact with the entities would be a federal offense, and that the Whitmore family was never to discuss the trading, the entities, or the government's visit with anyone. He invoked the Espionage Act, which was absurd, but in 1958 that act was a club. The government swung at anyone who had information it wanted, kept quiet. My father stood in the yard and watched the green sedan drive away down the Hoe River Road, and then he went into the house and sat at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands. My mother found him there when she came in from the laundry. She asked what happened. He told her. She sat down across from him and held his hands and said nothing for a long time. The fence went up 3 weeks later. A Forest Service crew arrived and installed 8-foot chain link fencing in a perimeter around the Flat Rock and the surrounding riverbank, approximately 200 yards in diameter. They posted signs that read, "Federal Wildlife Research Area, no trespassing, violators subject to fine and imprisonment." They installed a padlocked gate on the only access path. They did all of this in 2 days and left without speaking to my father. My father never went to the Flat Rock again. He never left salt or metal or coffee. He never drew another picture. The relationship that Amos Whitmore had begun in 1838, that Constance had maintained, that Henry had deepened into something approaching friendship, that Pearl had been saved by, that Constance the younger had studied with a naturalist's rigor, that Walter had tended with a bookkeeper's reliability, ended in the winter of 1958, not because either party wanted it to end, but because a government surveyor found tracks in the mud and did his job. I have thought about what happened from the other side of that fence, what the tall ones experienced. They had maintained a trading relationship with a single human family for 119 years. They had left medicine on a doorstep when a man was dying. They had sent the green powder when a woman was losing her child. They had drawn pictures of their families and their mountains and exchanged them for pictures of cabins and crops. They had raised their palms to 4 generations of Whitmores and had their greeting returned every time. And then, 1 month, the goods stopped coming. The salt stopped appearing on the Flat Rock. The metal, the cloth, the coffee, the sugar, all of it stopped. Instead, there was a fence and signs in a language they couldn't read, and the smell of metal and concrete where there had only ever been river water and cedar bark. They must have come to the rock. They must have seen the fence, and they must have understood, in whatever way they understand such things, that the arrangement was over, that the family they had traded with for 119 years had either abandoned them or been taken from them. I think about an old male, the one Constance described in 1909, or his grandson, or his great-grandson, standing at the edge of the tree line and looking at a chain-link fence surrounding a rock. where his people had left medicine and meat and drawings for longer than most human governments have existed. I think about what he might have felt. Confusion, certainly. Perhaps something like betrayal, though I don't know if they experience betrayal the way we do. Perhaps just a slow, heavy understanding that the small, bright thing in their world, the connection to the beings on the other side of the river who valued salt and gave metal, had gone dark. They stopped coming. My father listened for their vocalizations in the mountains for years after the fence went up, and the calls grew fewer and farther apart. By the mid-1960s, he said, the mountains above the farm had gone silent. Whether the tall ones had retreated deeper into the interior, or whether the combination of logging, road building, and the loss of their only sustained human contact had driven them from the area entirely, he didn't know. He just knew they were gone. I grew up carrying this knowledge the way my father carried it, as a weight that had no name and no place to be set down. I went to school, graduated, got a job at the Jefferson County clerk's office, married Betty in 1963, and built a life that was entirely ordinary on the surface and entirely hollowed out underneath by a secret I could never share. I kept the secret for the same reason my father did, because telling it would cost us the farm, would expose the family to prosecution, and would accomplish nothing for the tall ones who were already gone. Betty never knew. In 49 years of marriage, I never told her. That is the single deepest regret of my life, and I carry it the way you carry a stone in your pocket. Always there, always pressing against your leg, always reminding you of its presence. Betty deserved to know. She deserved to know why her husband sometimes stood at the kitchen window and stared at the mountains with an expression she could never quite read. She deserved to know why I went quiet the first time I took her to the Hoh River, and she said casually that it was the most peaceful place she'd ever been. She deserved to know that the peace she felt wasn't emptiness, it was absence. The absence of something that should still have been there and wasn't, because a man with a transit and a notebook had looked at the wrong stretch of riverbank and written down what he found. When I found the letters in 2012, alone in the farmhouse with Betty 6 weeks in the ground, and the sound of the river outside the window, I sat on the floor of my father's bedroom and read them for 6 hours, and then I read them again the next day and the next, and every day for 2 weeks. I read them with the trained eye of a records clerk and the heavy heart of a man who had just lost his wife and was discovering in the same season of grief that the secret he had carried for 65 years was only a fraction of the story. The letters told me things my father hadn't known or hadn't told me. The depth of the pictorial communication, the medical interventions, the slow building of trust across 4 generations. They told me that what the government had ended in 1958 was one of the longest sustained peaceful relationships between 2 species in the recorded history of North America, destroyed not by malice but by bureaucracy. A surveyor doing his job, a man in a suit protecting his jurisdiction, and a fence that cost maybe $400 that severed a bond worth more than anything the Department of the Interior had ever managed. After I finished reading the letters, I faced the same choice my father had faced: keep them hidden or let them out into the world. My father chose concealment because the threat was immediate and the consequences were real. The government had promised prosecution. The tall ones were already gone. What good would disclosure do? But that was 1958. This was 2012. The men who came to the farmhouse were almost certainly dead. The specific threat of prosecution under the Espionage Act was absurd and unenforceable decades later. And the world had changed. People were listening for stories like this in a way they hadn't been in the 1950s. The evidence for the existence of the tall ones, or Sasquatch, or Bigfoot, or whatever name you choose, had been accumulating for decades. Sightings, tracks, audio recordings, thermal footage, and a slowly growing body of genetic evidence from environmental DNA studies that kept turning up sequences that matched no known species. The letters wouldn't land in a vacuum. They'd land in a context where at least some people were ready to consider the possibility that the forests of the Pacific Northwest harbored something real. I took the letters to a historian first, a woman named Dr. Helen Graves at the University of Washington, who specialized in frontier-era Pacific Northwest documentation. I chose her because I'd read a paper she published on settler indigenous trade networks on the Olympic Peninsula, and I thought she would understand the significance of what the letters described without dismissing them out of hand. I drove to Seattle in March of 2013 with the cedar chest in the back seat of my car, wrapped in the same quilts I used to wrap Betty's good guitar when we moved. Helen Graves examined the letters for 4 months. She brought in paper conservators, ink chemists, a dendrochronologist, and a forensic handwriting analyst. Every test confirmed what I already knew. The letters were genuine documents produced over 119 years by members of the Whitmore family. No fabrication, no anachronism, no modern contamination. Helen told me in her office with the cedar chest sitting on her desk between us that the letters were one of the most significant collections of primary source documents she had ever examined, and that their contents described a phenomenon that had no parallel in the historical record. But Helen was a rigorous scholar. She needed corroborating evidence beyond the Whitmores' say-so. She found some. In the archives of the Olympic National Forest, she located Gerald Wick's survey report from 1957, misfiled in a record storage facility in Portland under a routine boundary survey designation. The report was there, including Wick's measured tract dimensions, his photographs, and his description of the trade goods. She also found, in the Bureau of Land Management's historical records, a memorandum from January of 1958, authorizing a site containment and material recovery action on the Hoh River, referencing anomalous biological indicators and unauthorized civilian contact with unclassified fauna. There was also the amber paste. My father had given the government most of what the family had, but the oilcloth wrappings of several letter bundles had been stained by the paste, which had seeped through the cedar bark containers over the decades. Helen had the residue analyzed at the university's biochemistry lab. The primary active component was a complex polysaccharide bound to a protein structure that the biochemist said she had never encountered in any published research. It had similarities to both honey and propolis, but with molecular structures that were entirely unique. The biochemist said the substance appeared to be deliberately prepared, not naturally occurring. Someone or something had made it. Helen Graves published a paper in 2014. Not about Bigfoot. She framed it as a study of frontier-era trade practices, describing the trading partner as an unidentified indigenous group. She included the chemical analysis as an appendix and mentioned the Wick survey report, but never used the word Sasquatch. She played it safe, and I understood why, but the paper attracted attention from a small group of researchers working on the biological evidence for an unclassified species in the Pacific Northwest. A biological anthropologist from British Columbia named Mark Erickson contacted Helen within a month. He'd been collecting environmental DNA from the Olympic Mountains for 6 years and had repeatedly found sequences matching no known species. When he compared his data to the protein analysis of the amber paste, he found correlations that were statistically significant. Whatever had produced the paste was biologically related to whatever was leaving DNA in the soil and bark of the deep Olympics. I met Mark Erickson in the summer of 2014. He drove to the farmhouse and spent 3 days walking the property, the river, and the area around the flat rock. He collected soil and bark samples. He measured the rock and noted scoring marks consistent with heavy objects being repeatedly placed and removed over a long period. Mark was the first person who said the word to me without flinching. We were sitting on the porch on his second evening, drinking coffee and watching the river, and he said, "Norman, what your family was trading with was a surviving branch of the human family. Your letters describe sustained, peaceful, reciprocal contact with Sasquatch, and the government shut it down because they couldn't control it and couldn't explain it and were terrified of what it meant." I asked him what it meant. He looked at the mountains turning purple in the last light and said the tall ones were not animals. Animals don't trade. Animals don't prepare medicine. Animals don't draw pictures of their families. Animals don't maintain a relationship with a single human lineage for 119 years. What the letters described was a culture, a small, hidden, ancient culture that had its own medicine, its own art, its own social structures, and its own understanding of exchange and obligation. A culture the United States government had identified, documented, confiscated evidence of, and then erased, because acknowledging it would have required reclassifying millions of acres of federal wilderness as the homeland of a people. And people have rights that wildlife does not. That conversation on the porch was 11 years ago. In the years since, I have shared the letters with a small number of researchers, historians, and journalists whom I trust. Helen Graves retired from the university in 2018 and has since published a fuller account of the letters in a book that received almost no mainstream attention, but has become, in certain circles, one of the most discussed documents in the field. Mark Erickson's environmental DNA work has expanded to include samples from 5 national forests in Washington and Oregon, and his findings, published in a genetics journal in 2020, confirmed the presence of an unidentified genome from something closely related to humans, distributed across the deep interior of the Olympic and Cascade Ranges. The genome shares approximately 96% of its DNA with modern humans, making it our closest living relative, closer than anything else science has identified, separated from us by perhaps 300,000 to 400,000 years of independent evolution. The tall ones are real. The letters prove they are real. The DNA proves they are real. The amber paste, still being analyzed a decade after I first handed a stained piece of oilcloth to a biochemist, proves they are real. And the fence that the federal government built around a flat rock on the Hoh River in 1958 proves something else. It proves that someone in a position of authority knew they were real and decided that the American public could not be trusted with that knowledge. I am 85 years old. I have no children. Betty and I were never able to have them, which is its own sorrow that I've carried alongside the other one. When I die, the farmhouse and the letters will pass to my nephew, Roy's boy, a man named Dale who lives in Sequim and who I told the full story to in 2015. Dale listened the way his father would have listened, quietly and with a stillness that meant he was taking it seriously. He said he'd protect the letters. He said he'd keep the farmhouse. He said he understood. I go to the flat rock sometimes. The fence is mostly gone now, collapsed and overgrown, swallowed by sword fern and salal, the way the forest swallows everything eventually. The rock itself is unchanged. Granite doesn't care about decades. It sits there in the river bend, flat and broad, and worn smooth by water and time and 119 years of bundles being placed on it and taken away. I stand there and I raise my palm, and I hold it out toward the tree line on the far bank, the way Constance did in 1846, the way Henry did in 1872, the way my grandfather did, the way my father did, the way I did when I was 9 years old and saw one of the people for the first and only time. Nobody raises a palm back. The forest is quiet. The tall ones are gone from this valley, driven deeper into the mountains or further north into the wilderness, or simply reduced to numbers too small to sustain whatever it was they were. The logging took their corridors. The roads took their silence. The government took their connection to the one human family that had treated them as what they were: neighbors, trading partners, people. But I stand there anyway. I stand there because the gesture matters, even when it's not returned. It matters because it says, I remember. I remember that you were here. I remember that you left medicine on a dying man's doorstep. I remember that you saved a woman and her unborn child with a green powder that no pharmacist could replicate. I remember that you drew pictures of your families and sent them across a river to people who drew pictures of theirs. I remember that you valued salt and metal and coffee and sugar, and that you paid for them with roots and paste and meat and art, and that you never once broke the terms of the arrangement in 119 years. The last letter in the collection is dated January the 16th, 1958. It was written by my father after the government left, and he tucked it behind the chest before plastering over the wall. It is the shortest letter in the entire archive, 7 sentences. It says, "The government came today. They took the journals and the drawings and the specimens. They said the trading is finished and we are not to go to the rock again. I have sealed the older letters in the chest and put the chest in the wall of the back bedroom. I do not know if anyone will ever find them. I do not know if finding them will matter. But I could not let them be taken because they are the only proof that what happened at this rock was real, and I will not give the last of it to men who will lock it in a filing cabinet and pretend it never existed." My father wrote that letter and sealed it with the others and plastered over the wall, and he never spoke of the letters again. He carried the secret for 31 more years until he died in 1989, and I carried it for 23 more years after that, until I opened a wall in his bedroom and found the truth he'd hidden. I am telling this story now because the letters deserve to be heard, not studied, not debated, not picked apart by academics arguing about methodology and provenance. Heard, the way you hear a neighbor tell you about something that happened to their family a long time ago. Something important, something true, something that changes the way you think about the place where you live and what shares it with you. The Olympic Mountains are still there. The old-growth forest, what's left of it, still stands. The Hoh River still runs cold and clear over that flat rock where my family left salt for 119 years. And somewhere in the deep places, in the valleys that have no names on any map and the ridges that have never felt a boot print, something still walks upright and breathes the same air we breathe and carries in its memory, if it has memory the way I believe it does, the knowledge that there was once a family of humans who kept their word. I was 9 years old when I saw one of the people. It raised its palm to me and I raised mine. I have lived 76 years since that morning, and I have never been more certain of anything than I am of what I saw. A person, standing on the far bank of the Hoh River, in the shadows of trees older than the Republic, looking at a child with eyes that held 111 years of knowing his family's name. It raised its hand. I raised mine. And for one moment, across 20 feet of river water and 300,000 years of separate evolution, we recognized each other. That moment is what the government tried to erase. That recognition, that proof that we are not alone on this continent and never have been. The letters document it, the science supports it. The fence they built to stop it has rusted and fallen, and I am standing at the rock with my palm raised, telling you what my family knew, what the government buried, and what the mountains have never forgotten. My name is Norman Whitmore. I am 85 years old. The letters are real. The people are real. And the longest trade agreement in American history didn't end because it failed. It ended because it worked too well and the wrong man found out about it, and the men who came after him decided that a century of peace between two species was less important than a filing cabinet and a fence. I raised my palm. Something raised its palm back once, 76 years ago, on a river that still runs through a valley that still remembers. That is all I have to give you. That and 214 letters in a cedar chest that smells like beeswax and history, written by people who knew the truth and kept it, and a government that learned the truth and killed it, and one old man who found the truth in a wall and is finally, after all these years, saying it out loud.